This third video in the Managing Multi-Business Firms focuses more on the policies and procedures firms use to manage the firm. As you can see, it talks about developing a corporate infrastructure, including things like controls and coordinations, as well as developing top-down initiatives that then must be communicated to achieve the firm's strategic objectives. The three basic building blocks of corporate infrastructure are coordination and control systems to help their various business units work together to achieve the firm's objectives. Designing compensation and incentive systems to promote the right activities, the right orientation of managerial decision making towards achieving these objectives, and then developing an organizational culture that supports the firm's strategy and promote the right amount of risk taking and really get the employees to make decisions toward organizational goals without having to put in too many policies and procedures in place and relying on that unwritten or those undocumented norms from culture to govern organizational behavior. In terms of corporate control systems and coordination systems, there are two basic approaches. In general, firms follow some balance of both, but it's important to see the philosophy behind it. On the left-hand side, we have input controls, and here the goal is to provide relatively heavy monitoring and centralized approval of decisions. And this is done through strategic planning systems and capital expenditures that involve things like annual operating budgets, spending limits, and the requirement to fill out requests for certain decisions of a certain dollar amount or of a certain nature. And here the goal or the philosophy is if we control the inputs, then we'll be able to make sure those inputs are put towards productive uses to achieve our goals. This involves a more centralized, hands-on approach. On the right-hand side, we are more output-based, where we focus on setting performance targets and then make sure those performance targets are achieved. We set a bunch of policies and procedures that are very basic in terms of allowing the more decentralized decision-making. And as long as the divisions hit their targets using the resources provided, then they are allowed to operate somewhat autonomously. And really, again, the goal here is to identify what type of system will best work for achieve the strategic objectives. Heavy coordination among business units is likely to lead to more input controls, whereas, for example, a more unrelated diversified firm where the firms are different and the divisions are different and do not need much coordination are more likely to focus on output controls. Thus, the firm needs to balance what it is trying to achieve with the complexity involved and also the cultural implications of an input control versus an output control in things like centralization of decision making and the freedom and autonomy of the divisions and the managers. The second lever of firm infrastructure involves designing compensation and incentive systems. And really here the goal is to designate performance metrics that will be used to be monitored and determined to provide compensation to the firm's managers at all levels. The primary objectives here are to enable the unit managers to make effective decisions and to allow headquarters to manage this process and make sure the decision making is appropriate for this firm's strategic objectives, and then praise the performance of those managers and reward appropriate performance. If managers are following and making the decisions that the firm wants them to make or that headquarters wants them to make, they're rewarded with additional compensation, additional incentives. The secondary objectives of these compensation systems are also to allow communication to be common across all divisions. This allows the managers to talk to each other knowing what the targets are, and therefore we can then compare the divisions with each other but also against rival firms. Overall, the idea of compensation incentive systems is rather than provide a restriction or constraint, this is to provide almost a carrot or a goal and reward system so that if the managers make decisions that are appropriate with the firm's strategic objectives, they're rewarded through greater compensation and or greater incentives. The third and final part of corporate management here and infrastructure is how to manage the linkages between the different units, particularly when sharing of resources is needed. Typically, the corporate level is responsible for any of the centralized services and functions, such as accounting, legal, and possibly marketing and R&D, depending on the nature of the firm. The goal is to avoid duplication and increase efficiency. However, at the SBU level, these SBUs must be coordinated as needed through strategic planning and or operational and strategy coordination. So for example, in a related diversified firm where the firm is operating in several related businesses, SBU coordination must be high, and the corporate headquarters wants to foster very high levels of strategy and operational coordination where stages of the value chain work together, particularly if they're shared. However, in a more unrelated diversified firm, for example, strategy and operational coordination is less needed, and therefore the SBU linkages are less of a concern, and the SBUs operate somewhat autonomously. When SBU linkages are needed to be strong for coordination and control, typically firms use cross-divisional teams to foster that coordination and make sure information sharing is taking place at the optimal level. This leads us to the different approaches corporate headquarters may use to manage their businesses. In the portfolio approach, generally there's very limited coordination. The SBUs are autonomous and left alone and run as if they're their own separate companies, and simply coordinate with the parent for allocation of resources and possibly broad strategic guidance. The restructuring approach is similar to the portfolio approach. However, there's a bit heavier hand or more hands-on approach by corporate management in terms of coming into the SBUs, fixing them, acquiring poorly run companies, installing new processes, improving performance, and then eventually transitioning back to the portfolio approach. So the restructuring approach is only when needed to fix problems within the units. So the first two really involve a more autonomous SBU and less coordination between divisions. The bottom two are more focused for related firms or vertically integrated firms where there must be sharing across the divisions. So in the third approach in terms of transferring skills, again, there's great decentralization here, but the corporate headquarters is heavily involved in making sure capabilities and resources are transferred through personnel and through best practices, and so knowledge is really pushed down from corporate headquarters, and any of the best practices are shown to corporate headquarters and then pushed down to other divisions. And so this is a little bit more hands-on than the first two, but again, there's still a fair degree of autonomy and not as much sharing between divisions. The final and fourth one, sharing activities, involves very heavy coordination across the SBUs, and corporate management plays a very strong role in enforcing this coordination and setting up an infrastructure that allows for and creates opportunities for coordination. And really here it's setting up control systems that require multi-divisional teams, resources and capabilities that are shared across divisions, and oftentimes the value chain activities may be shared across divisions as the headquarters intervenes in operations. So as we go down from top to bottom, the role of headquarters increases in terms of involvement in the SBU activities and decision making. In addition, as we move from top to bottom, the linkages between SBUs become stronger and coordination is more required to achieve strategic objectives.